Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody had those from around the world. Good evening or good afternoon. I hope everybody's having a good day so far. And welcome again to the Bioenergy Society of Singapore's conference for today and tomorrow. It's a pleasure to have all of you here, and we look forward to your participation. I would also like to thank all the speakers, keynote speakers for today, Professor Nic Lindley and Dr. Ping, for being able to join us and give the keynote lectures. Also, thank Professor Roger Ron, who is kindly able to give us also the keynote lecture also. Now, so my name is Tong Yen Wah. I'm from the National University of Singapore, and also E2S2 create one of the National Research Foundation programs from Singapore. I'm a member of the Bioenergy Society of Singapore, and I'll be chairing today's session. So for this morning's session, this is the keynote session for the first day, and we have two speakers this morning. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Nic Lindley. He will be giving a talk on possibilities and constraints to reduce the environmental footprint of the food biotechnology pipeline. Professor Lindley has been long been associated with Singapore since 2015. He is currently the Senior Scientific Advisor and Director of Discovery and Biotransformation at SIFBI, that is the Singapore Institute of Food and Biotechnology Innovations, one of the many research institutes at our A-Star in Singapore. He has been with A-Star since 2015, and he's still associated with France, so he has a joint appointment with Toulouse Biotechnology Institute, and has been sharing some positions there currently. Before he joined Singapore, he was the executive director of the Toulouse Biotechnology Institute. And he was also director of the Toulouse Genomic Platform from 2011 to 2016. He joined Singapore to help Singapore build up the biotransformation innovation platform and became a founding director for this very important platform for Singapore. As you know, Singapore is developing its food and biotechnology program, and he has been helping out Singapore for a lot of this important work. So I won't take up too much time. So let us all welcome Professor Lindley to give the first keynote lecture for this morning. Professor Lindley, please.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Yeah, the slides are up. The part of the delay is my problem. I can't manage to share my screen, so we're going to have to go through Hanli to change the slides. Can we move to the next slide, please? Everything looks a little bit slow. And I've chosen in this introductory talk to actually give you some global perspectives on agricultural land use, food supply chain, and obviously the environmental footprint. You see that these are all to some extent linked, so we have to have a coordinated effort to make best use of our food. The next slide. So if we look at the sort of world dynamics, what we can see is we have a very rapidly increasing world population, and that is going to lead to an increasing amount of arable land, or at least to say a higher level of productivity necessary from the land. We estimate about a 50% increase in food requirements before 2050. But at the same time, we are actually losing arable land very, very quickly. I think it talks to me as an ex-football player. We're losing a soccer pitch every second of arable land. So we're in a sort of a catch-22 situation where we're going to have to produce more and more food from less and less land. And as you can see on the right of this screen, you're actually going to be moving towards less than 1/8 of a hectare per person has got to produce the food we require. So next slide, please. Or if we look at how the land is being used at the moment, this is information taken from a really great website, Our World in Data, which gives you a lot of background information on agricultural land. We can see that we've got about 50 million square kilometers of agricultural land. So 3/4 of that is used for livestock farming, on the animals themselves, but also the feed production for those animals. And about 1/4 is the crops for human use. Huh? And if we look at that, you see that those ratios are more or less inversed if you look at the global calorie supply or the global protein supply. So we're producing a rather small amount of food in the form of livestock, which is using the majority of our land. This is probably why we're beginning to work towards a more plant-based diets in the future to be able to feed people properly. But we'll see there are consequences to this plant protein type logic as we move through the talk. Huh? So if we could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is just to illustrate to some extent to the, I see the slide, it's getting there. To the amount of land which is used to produce every 100 grams of protein. And you can quite clearly see that the lamb and beef is extremely expensive from a sort of land use point of view. These are the major targets today for cellular agriculture to try and reduce this environmental footprint. As you move down, you can see that you gradually get smaller and smaller amounts of land required to produce the same amount of protein. The quality of the protein, of course, is not always the same, but that is, I would say, a minor problem when you compare it to the land use and the environmental issues which are associated. Next slide, please. Yeah, if you look at this again now, if we look at it, turn to it, what are the consequences of agriculture? You see that it's a pretty big contributor to climate change at the moment. I think I don't have a slide for this, unfortunately, but if you consider agriculture as a country, it would come third in the world behind China and the US as major producers of greenhouse gas emissions. So it does have a natural cost of production, which is quite high, but there are also, as we will see, extremely significant climate change causes because of food wastage. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is sort of it's looking at the livestock aspects of the environmental impact, but you could extend it to overall agriculture. But as we've seen, livestock is the biggest single contribution. So we're actually, it's using a significant amount of water, it's producing a lot of greenhouse gas, but it's also leading to degradation of the grazing, the natural land use. So this is partly why land available for agriculture is decreasing progressively over the last few years. Now that's the negative side. If we look at on the positive side in the next slide. Yeah, what we're seeing is that actually the efficiency of agriculture is increasing. This has been done partly because we now have a lot of information on the genetics, both of animals and crops. So we're getting better at organizing the agriculture. We're beginning to understand better the microbiome, and in particular the rumen microbiome, which allows us to get better use of the food we're giving to the animals. And we're also working significantly on the feed content. We're both processing the feed to make it more digestible, but we're also boosting it with supplements such as amino acids to actually boost up the plant protein with sort of the essential amino acids that are necessary for more efficient use of the food for the animal. So gradually the environmental cost is going to be slightly better, but I think we're also getting to a point where those improvements are reaching a sort of a threshold level, and future gains are going to be more and more difficult. Huh? Next slide, please. Yeah, if we go back now to the initial concept that we need to feed more and more people, you'll see that there are, to some extent, some contradictions with the observations we've just seen. We need, by 2030, to have a significant increase, about 35% increase in our agricultural land use. We've also seen that we have less and less land, and that our increases in agricultural production are beginning to slow down. So, probably the answer, and this is where we're going to switch over to the waste approach, is that we need to use that land better, and we need to use the products coming from that land in a more efficient manner. So if we move to the next slide, please. Just before we get to that, I just want to point out that there are consequences of climate change also for crops. We can see 9 out of 10 major crops will actually see their productivity decrease, which is going to reduce the food supply chain, but it's also going to lead to potential price increases, which is going to make food more expensive to buy, and therefore not really coherent with our wish to feed the entire world population. So if we move on now to the waste aspect. Next slide, please. Or move 2 slides on. Yeah, this is a really nice photo of this. I don't think you see this very often, not even in Singapore, where we waste quite a lot. But it's yeah, okay. This is the situation at the moment. We are actually wasting about 1/3 of the world food production. This is a significant amount of food which is being produced and being wasted. At the same time, we have about more than 800 million people who don't have enough food to eat, and that figure is going to increase. Now, this food wastage takes place throughout the food chain. It's not localized in any one area, and it's very variable from one country to another. In poorer countries, most of that food wastage is probably due to spoilage, particularly in tropical countries, whereas in the richer countries, it's more due to consumer wastage. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the type of wastage we see. The amount of food waste which is being wasted by person per year. Some of the countries, sort of the big food producers, actually waste far more than anyone else. Southeast Asia is pretty well situated, but Singapore is an exception within Southeast Asia, and it is more or less aligned with the level of food wastage that you see in Europe. Next slide, please. Okay, food wastage, social problem. It's also an economic problem. We're actually spending several $1,000s perhaps per year per person, or at least per family, in food which is actually destined to go to be thrown into the dustbin, basically. This has a significant climate change effect. If the waste is going to landfill, it tends to produce methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And as we say, it produces also a lot of CO2. So it is the combined efforts are quite large. And food is, at least in the American trash, it's nearly a quarter of what is thrown away into the dustbin every week. So it is a significant problem. And where there's a significant problem, it means there is also a significant possibility to change things. Next slide, please. And this is, we talk about global food waste, but it is rather variable if you look amongst the different foods which are out there in the market. It's higher in fruit and vegetables, roots and tubers. So the plant crop production actually has a higher wastage level. It is intrinsically more efficient as a production unit, but it is actually leading to higher levels of waste. And I think this we have to bear in mind if we want to move forward. So as we move through, then this is the amount again. As you'll see, a lot of the waste is in production losses. Some of it is in consumer waste. And as I say, in the richer countries, consumer waste is considerably more important. So let's move through to get a graphic on the next slide, please. This is really just to show you that all the way through the process, from the actual growth to it coming into your fridge at home and then being thrown into your dustbin at home, there are waste losses which are very variable. It's just to show you that in all cases, we have a significant amount of food waste spread out throughout the food production process. So this is variable from one side to another. Fish is a little bit lower. Meat is actually lower loss, and dairy products are lower loss. But particularly as you look in the crops, it's only really the oil crops and beans which hit that same level of relatively small yield loss. So the classical grains and sort of major grown crops have a significant loss. Next slide, please. There's going with that loss, we also have quite a significant effect on resource management. We are actually spending 40% of the world's resources on producing food, which is really used to produce waste material, which is then lost to the system with very high carbon emissions. But also, as you look at that, it's really there's a possibility to gain on efficiency, either by reducing the loss or alternatively by recycling that waste material into something which is useful. So if we now move next slide, please, or next two slides, let's look at the Singapore situation. You know, this is where we talked about the world situation, but where does Singapore situate? And I'd like to just to illustrate before we move to specifically to waste, that there is a concept about what we call the Overshoot day. And that is a date in which the actual resources available to the planet are terminated. And then we move over to the sort of more fossil stored non-renewable sources. And that date in 2021, I don't have the figures for 2022, but for 2021 was the 29th of July, you know, slightly more than halfway through the year. Now, if you look at Singapore, we reached that date on the 10th of April. Which puts us amongst the world leaders, basically in sort of poor use of potential world resources. Next slide. What was coming through is that this is also reflected in the food waste statistics. Now, we're going to probably be giving this figure throughout the day, but 11% of total waste in Singapore is food related waste. More than 665,000 tons of waste per year. This is probably our major resource for biotech type applications, in fact, is the waste material. It's equivalent to 9 million cups of cooked rice per day. And if you think of it as a volume, you could fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool with waste which is produced in Singapore every single day of the year. So this is a huge amount of material, which is often pretty good as a food base. Nutritionally, it's good, and this is just getting thrown away and going towards non-productive use. Next slide, please. Yeah, we're pretty proud, I think, in Singapore on our total world rankings, and one we're not so proud about is the waste ranking. We're about 5th in the world for waste production. This is pretty good. Most of that is actually incinerated. Used to go into landfill. So I suppose incinerating does at least create some energy as heat. So we're recovering something from that waste, but it is a major loss, particularly when you take into account that most of the food we eat in Singapore is actually imported with rather expensive and environmentally unfriendly transport costs. So really, we do have an opportunity here to be able to do something with that amount of waste material. If we move to the next slide, please. Okay, just keeping one eye on the clock. Okay, we're about halfway. So this is, food waste, unfortunately, is not the best substrate for biotechnological applications. And why is this? It's a rich substrate, but it's a very variable substrate. Different forms of waste have different composition. And this makes it rather difficult to treat. Now, there are other issues which make that sort of accessibility a little bit more difficult. There are logistic issues of collection. And that I can remember working with Okara when it comes out of the soybean pressing. It is pretty free of any microbial contamination. By the time it's been in the heat for a couple of hours, it is very, very heavily contaminated with spoilage organisms. So really, if we want to use it to extract food, then we probably have to be treating it directly at source. Now that's industrial side streams are pretty standard in their composition. If you take into account the huge amount of waste that's coming out of our hawker centers, then that is a mixture. And it is pretty impossible to predict, what the mixture is going to be from a day-to-day purpose. And this makes, as part of the reason that actually treating that waste and produce useful products is quite a difficult objective, and it has its own constraints. So, next slide, please. So what would we like to do in an ideal world? Obviously the best way to use waste is to avoid producing the waste, to make it more efficient use of the food which is available, notably to feed people. We can, of course, recycle some of that waste into animal feed, but also we can extract in a biorefinery type logic certain key chemicals and biomaterials. I think we're going to hear quite a lot about this use as we go through the conference over the next couple of days. But there are quite a number of sort of proven systems nowadays which make better use. And we're seeing industrial development. People are able to produce products like bioplastics out of food waste with quite good efficiency. And these are being industrially developed at the moment. So it is an exploding domain. Because of the complexity, one of the key factors in recycling is to try and digest the food anaerobically, because anaerobic populations can basically channel the food, the diversity of the food, into key metabolites, fermentation end products, which themselves can be useful for further exploitation. Next slide, please. This is a slide taken from some of the Singapore groups. I'm not sure if you're going to discuss it in this particular BESS conference, but one of the ways we've been trying to treat this is, instead of putting it into landfill or basic incineration, to actually include the food waste in the anaerobic digestion. It's sort of the classical wastewater treatment process, in which we're sort of regenerating the water, producing biogas, methane, which can then be turned into electricity. And as we've seen, this can, to some extent, offset one of the other major causes of climate use of the food waste. And what the question we need to be asking is, can we make a better use of this resource? Next slide, please. We blocked. Yeah. Okay. So this is the sort of, can we move away from mixed waste, single product, into a situation where we can actually use a biorefinery type logic. We can using the waste, mixing it up, solid liquid, to create, and using the potential of the acidogenesis process to actually produce short chain fatty acids and alcohols, as well as biohydrogen potentially. And then actually moving that into a second phase when some of these products can be used to produce different compounds. This could be methane, could be biofuels, could be fatty acids, mixed alcohols, bioplastics, etc. And really, this is sort of opens up a challenge for biotechnology. Just how far can we make this transformation feasible? Next slide, please. So this is really, I think, the basis of some of the reflections we've been having at SIFBI, but also been reflections which are mirrored in many of the waste degradation strategies throughout the world, is really, can we use this diversity of substrates, get them to converge via use of anaerobic metabolism into key synthons, which can then be chemical products, which we can then use. And our logic has been, can we actually convert that to single cell protein using microorganisms as a source of the single cell protein, whether they be yeast, bacteria, or filamentous fungi. These are, we have sort of food grade strains which are available, which grow very well on this type of compound. So we can diversify the strain choice. We can produce a lot of sort of essential amino acids, and the protein content in microbes is quite high, certainly higher than in meat. So it's a sort of good input to boost our protein production. Of course, microbes are not the only way to do this, and you could reason as well that some of the solid waste, once it's been partially degraded and sort of the useful compounds extracted, you could then use technologies like the insect larvae technology, which I'm sure we're going to hear about later later today. So these are possibilities converge a very heterogeneous waste source into a common intermediary, and then use that to diversify into different products. Next slide, please. So yes, this is again one of the problems which we have in this type of strategy is that some of the wastes are not easy to degrade, sort of soluble sugars, and we have a lot of cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, but also a lot of protein in amongst this this food waste system. Can we use that? Of course, we can partially use enzymatic hydrolysis to pre-treat the food as we're changing its structure to increase the size of the food waste. The more finely ground the food waste is, the more rapidly it can be degraded. So we go through a sort of extrusion coupled to enzymatic pre-treatment, and then we can use some of the cellulitic microorganisms and even the lignolytic organisms which are present in the anaerobic digester to break this down. Okay, well, if we do that in a two-stage system, we get microbial biomass being produced, but we could also produce useful value-added bioproducts. About 15 years ago, just to give an example, we worked with Veolia, which is one of the major, I think it's the major water treatment company, and they're pretty well installed in the waste collection and treatment in Singapore. I believe they have the major market, and we actually worked on the anaerobic digester. Those of you who are specialists in anaerobic digestion will probably know one of the big problems is that under certain conditions, notably for pH, you block the methane production and you accumulate acetate. So this was something we exploited with Veolia by putting in a next stage in which that blocked methanogenic digester, which was accumulating acetate, could actually be fed in with strains which could convert that acetate into polyhydroxybutyrate. So we had a very good industrially validated system in which we could convert some of our waste, not only food waste, but other sources of waste as well, including domestic waste, and generate significant amounts of bioplastics. So you can do things which sort of have a general impact on the way we produce some of the compounds we need to replace not only our food supply, but also our dependence on fossil fuels. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the illustration which basically broadens that concept with a number of different examples, but the number of examples you can slot in on phase 2 is quite enormous. You know, any biotechnological process in which the organism is capable of growing on the organic acids will effectively enable you to produce virtually any type of useful food ingredient or chemical specialty chemicals. So we can do a lot of this, and it's dependent on the mastering of the anaerobic submerged membrane bioreactor system. Yeah? So we can do that. We can plot it in. We can produce a whole variety. I've concentrated here on certain aspects which are more lipid based rather than protein based, depending on what the strains we're growing. We can produce things like biodiesels. We can also produce puffer, more high value products, which are very good nutrient boosting. So we can produce a whole variety of different compounds here. Now, if we move on to the very last slide to try and conclude, I think here now. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the significance of this particular approach, we've seen food waste is an enormous sort of loss of agricultural production. It's almost immoral that we should be producing quite so much a sort of waste in our system. And it has its own challenges because it is so diverse. It's not an easy substrate to use. But if you can convert it into simple molecules and easily, readily consumable molecules, we can actually transform a waste stream from being a pollution problem to being a resource, and it then becomes part of our resource management strategy. Now, the question then is exactly what type of compounds can we produce from these organic acids? But I think we're going to hear from the rest of the conference that diversity is quite large, and we can in fact produce a whole variety of different products, which otherwise we would be using sort of easily consumable sugars to produce. And perhaps these should be reserved for compounds which are not so simple to produce using the waste material. So it's a new platform is potential here, a new platform for microbial products from an inexpensive source. If we're trying to be worldwide competitive, then the cost of our products, particularly if we're looking at commodity or bulk chemical type products, is based to 3/4 of the price is the cost of the feedstock. So, so using a negative cost feedstock makes this type of replacement of fossil fuel derived chemical compounds something which becomes economically viable. So, take home message. Excuse me. We can provide a new sustainable solution to help strengthen food security. We can recycle these products. We can extract useful products from these waste streams, but we can also transform it into compounds which can then be converted into new food products. And for those, the residue, we can still send this into methane production as a final option to generate efficient energy production. The message behind this, we can transform this pollution problem into a useful resource. And at that point, I think the last slide is just a thank you slide, which will enable me to move to the very last slide, please. Yeah, to thank you all for listening. Sorry for the technical hitches. I'm not sure why, but from the other end of the world in the middle of the night, we don't seem to be able to get our screen sharing. But let me just thank you all for listening, but also my two co-authors, my colleagues at SIFBI, who were mentioned on the first slide, Eric and Melanie, who've helped sort of develop the strategy we are currently putting in place within SIFBI for actually using these wastes as a useful carbon source. So thank you all, and I'm open to any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Lindley. So now we have time for questions from the audience and also panel members. Please do type in your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll read them out to Professor Lindley. There's one question already from the panel members, let me take this. It's from Mr. Ong. So it says, in pre-COVID times for Singapore for food waste, Singapore has twice as many visitors, tourists, than local population. Do you think that would skew the statistics for countries that have very high proportions of visitors versus locals in terms of food waste being disposed of?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, but I would say this is probably reasonably marginal. And I think if you look at food waste, looking at country by country, what you see is there is a very direct correlation between the level of quality of life in a country and the amount of waste that we produce. And I think Singapore fits into that general model. In countries where food is expensive, wages are low, then you tend to avoid wasting what is a significant part of your budget. And I think this doesn't make Singapore, it makes it as different from perhaps the local countries which may not have the same sort of freely abundant wages that we do in Singapore. The cost of living is high, but the wages are very high in Singapore. And this, when things are abundant, we tend to respect them less. And I think this is probably more a cause of Singapore's food wastage. It is the fact that we don't have to be careful how much we spend on the food, so it's we tend to waste it. It's exactly the same logic as US, Australia, Europe. We're all virtually in the same level of food wastage. And I think it correlates more to economic wealth than to tourism.
Thank you. Now we have one question in the Q&A box. Let me read that. So thank you, Professor Lindley, for the talk. Is there also effort to merge scientific solutions with logistics solution in hybrid projects? For example, we produce already enough, so can we improve the distribution or shelf life rather than to try to produce more?
Well, yeah, I think that there is a big loss during distribution. And that is something which is specific, not to Singapore, but to tropical countries. The ambient heat around and the humidity tends to create food spoilage. So yes, there are things you can do along that supply chain to reduce loss. How can you? Because you've seen, I think, in the data that the biggest loss is in the fruit and vegetable industry, and with these tend to perish very quickly. So if you can add coating technologies, for example, to actually prevent the spoilage organisms growing on the surface, is something which these coatings are invisible. You can't see them. They're edible, so they have no problem from a food point of view. And this can sort of slow down the speed with which the fruit and vegetables actually get lost to the system. You also have to, something I didn't touch on today in the talk, but there is also a significant amount of food which is lost from what we call the ugly fruit. You know, these are the fruit which don't meet the aesthetic ideas of what an apple should look like, for example. It's this sort of disformed, slightly discolored. These fruits are left on the shelf and get thrown out at the end of the week. And this is something they have exactly the same nutritional value as the beautiful fruit, but the ugly fruit never get eaten. And done. And perhaps we need to recognize this and to orientate some of this product into this sort of food processing industry where you don't actually see the superficial appearance of the food. And so doing better sorting at the fruit at the production level, extending shelf life when it's possible, thinking about can you lyophilize fruit, for example, to preserve it over a long period and transform it into other types of fruit and vegetables. The whole series of different approaches, but it's you have to be aware that you're not going to have a huge effect on shelf life for this type of perishable compound. But yeah, you have to look at it. You also have to get people to use the food they buy in the order they buy it. We all see things at the back of our fridge which we've forgotten about and eventually get thrown away. And I think this probably is as big a loss as the shelf life extension. I hope I'm not sure if that covers the question fully, but it's all these, as we've seen, the food loss is distributed throughout the system. So any gains you can make is going to reduce food loss. And I think the World Health Authority has put I think it's 2030, but it may be 2050 deadline in which we hope to reduce food loss and food wastage by 50%. And that's quite an ambitious target, but it would mean 20% more of the food getting into our stomachs rather than into our waste, our dustbins.
Thank you, Professor Lindley. I do have a question myself. The last part of your presentation on the biorefinery concept is very interesting. So if you can produce the consistent product from a very heterogeneous type of input of the mixed food waste. So one consideration is whether these kind of technologies, would they consume a lot of energy and would they be very expensive in terms of what you can achieve? So if we do a complete life cycle analysis, we show that this kind of way to convert food waste into something useful be more sustainable or less sustainable?
Yeah, I worked with Jonathan at Simtech on the life cycle analysis of various different alternative food production, and you know it is not as convincing when you look at the details as it would like to be, partly because the energy cost as soon as you start transforming material is quite high. So you recycle waste, but you tend to change your climate effect rather from an indirect food sort of pollution aspect to an energy cost. So all intensified reactions require a certain amount of energy. So yeah, there is an energetic cost. However, if you look at it in a more full cycle, some of your food is still going to be converted to compounds like methane. You know, no matter how much you can extract out, you're still going to be left with some non-easily degradable foods, which can be used for energy production. So you can see it as a closed loop, that as a byproduct of your transformation is also the energy, which you can then use to actually develop your bioprocess. And perhaps one thing which I didn't hit on this, which is a disadvantage of any biotechnology, is that at the end of the day, once you've used your microorganisms to produce an interesting product, you're always left with a lot of biomass from your reactor. Now, if this is sort of genetically engineered biomass, it's virtually impossible to use until public opinion changes and the regulatory authorities realize it's not so dangerous. In the meantime, that is something which is a waste flow. So you have to reintroduce all that biomass back into your closed cycle, and again to try and convert it into some form. Now, since this is not going to be simple to put into the food chain, maybe this is where you'll be producing your electricity from. You know, it's a two form. You can convert it to methane. Very, very high efficiency conversion. You know, one of the advantages of anaerobic metabolism is that 90% of the consumed carbon is actually found in the products. So it's a very, very high intensity conversion system. So you get quite a lot of methane, and you get a little bit of composted cell material at the end of the day, which can't be converted, but that can go into composting for your agricultural system. So it's, yeah, you can see it as a closed cycle in which the energy can be generated from other aspects of the sort of overall process.
Very good, thank you, Professor. There's another question in the Q&A box. The question is from Malama. So are there some data on how much food is being lost through our various supermarkets or wet markets? It might help and further identify methods to reduce these food waste.
I'm not sure if that data exists for Singapore, but such studies have been done elsewhere. And this tends to be something which is pretty much the same as you move from one country to another. If you're into a sort of highly, sort of, shall we say, wealthy country, the supermarket losses are pretty well documented. So yeah, there are things we can do to attack that aspect and to actually try and reduce the losses. As I said earlier, the ideal situation is not to treat the waste. The ideal situation is not to produce the waste. But you know, there is only so much that you can do to optimize that flow. We see, I'm not sure if you see that in Singapore with COVID. I've not been in Singapore for a couple of years now, but in Europe, you see more and more sort of offers on the shop shelves for products which are getting close to their expiry date and would have to be thrown away. So that we're seeing these being at a reduced price to try and evacuate them to avoid them going into dustbins outside the supermarket. So that is taking place. And there's also a collect system in which that food is sent to communities in need, you know, nearby. There are, unfortunately, in many places of the world, even in rich countries, there are people who are falling below the poverty line, who are lacking food. And the supermarkets are becoming quite active at recycling what otherwise would be thrown away into food kitchens, which are being then used as sort of social support for the more needy parts of the population. Now that's probably not going to be a huge part of the population in Singapore, but yeah, you can work through on reducing the loss by the way you structure your retail logic.
Yeah, I believe there's still a lot of hungry people in Singapore that we appreciate those food.
As we see, we got one coming in.
There's a question from Dr. Low from the Malaysian Commonwealth Board. He says, hi, Dr. Lindley. Is there already a food waste based on other biomass-based biorefinery commercial plants in Singapore? What is the main factor to be considered for commercial exploitation to realize a biorefinery plant?
Yes, it's it. But to be honest, I'm not sure if there is any commercial. There's a lot of research, as we're going to hear over the next few days, to try and work out how we can sort of use some of that food waste. So I would say it's in the process of being accumulated, and hopefully that will get transformed into some commercial operations. There may be one or two, but to my knowledge, a lot of that food waste is still sort of going towards incineration, which is better than landfill. So we're not doing it yet. We touched on what some of the problems of biorefinery plant is. Really, in order to make it efficient, at least the food processing waste is something which, if it's done on site, you can avoid the spoilage, because it really is a logistic problem. There are situations in Singapore, I know, where some of the hawker centers are sort of collecting their waste and transforming it to compost. We worked at ISIS with Westcom to do this in a very efficient process, which produces sort of very good organic fertilizers from what would otherwise be just going into landfill or incineration. So that is working, and it's a sort of delocalized small scale, but if you put it all together, it becomes a significant amount. But I'm not sure we're sort of deriving a lot of value added products at the moment. And there are big opportunities. Singapore's food industry also uses a lot of cooking oil for its noodle production. This, if you look at it on a worldwide basis, this is billions of tons. So it is also a resource you can transform. And that is something which maybe is something in Singapore which is worth collecting, because it is more stable than the organic food waste, classically, the fruit and vegetable type waste. But yeah, I don't see there is any real big scale commercial biorefinery other than the methane production. This is something which a lot of the food waste is now collected and centralized and converted to methane. So that is something which is ongoing. But that's probably the lowest value added product you can produce. So it's so if we want to make money out of the food waste, then we really have to think on a different level.
Great. I don't see any more questions, and we are very appreciative of your presentation, Professor Lindley, and also for you to take your time to join us this morning, or this afternoon.
Middle of the night for me.
So
no, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning at the moment, so it's right in the middle of the night. But I was planning to be in Singapore. It had to be pushed back because there is just some other business which became urgent in France. So it will be January now before I come over. So it's been a pleasure. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and I hope we now move into what we can actually do with this food waste in the follow-up presentations.
Thank you very much, Professor Lindley.
Bye for now.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.